Welcome. My name is Marianne Dornan, and I have the pleasure of introducing our two guest speakers today. We're actually performers, if you will. Rob Mermin founded Circus Smirkus in 1987 in the hills of Greensboro, Vermont. Since then, he has transformed the lives of countless performers aged 10 through 18, meaning that kids no longer need to run away to join the circus, as Rob did himself when he was 19. He studied with mimes Marcel, Etienne, Decroux, and working in circuses in England, Denmark, Hungary, and the Soviet Union. He's also the former dean of Clown College for Ringling Bros and Barnum and Bailey Circus, president of the all-youth Blackfriars Summer Theater, artist in residence for the Vermont Arts Council, and creator of Vermont's Circus Residency program for the state's public schools. Now, Rob Gurwitt is a freelance writer living in Norwich, and he has his own adventures in writing for a variety of publications, including the Congressional Quarterly. His stories have appeared in such publications as the New York Times, Salon, and Mother Jones. In 2000, he wrote a story on Circus Smirkus for Double Take, which led to the collaboration that brings him and Rob Mermin to the Burlington Book Festival today. The two have joined forces to share the story of a troupe that has been called the United Nations of the Youth Circus World for its culture exchanges with 24 companies. Their highly acclaimed new book, Circus Smirkus, 25 Years of Running Home to the Circus, details Smirkus' ups and downs from its early beginning as a ragtag group teaching circus skills and life lessons to its current status as a premier providing ground for, premier traveling proving ground for kids and circus dreams. I mentioned earlier to both of them that I'm a retired school principal, and I would give anything to have them on staff as they inspire youth and adults alike. Please welcome to the 8th Annual Burlington Book Festival, Rob Mermin and Rob Gurwitt.
That's Rob Gurwitt.
Right.
This is Rob Mermin.
We'll be quizzing you after. Thank you for coming. I realize we're competing against a beautiful day and lunch, and so we really appreciate your coming. We are here to talk about this book, again, Circus Smirkus, 25 Years of Running Home to the Circus. It's actually an amazing story, which is, as a writer, is what attracted me to working on it with Rob. But before we talk about the book, we thought we'd set the scene a little bit with just a 5-minute film that a filmmaker named Andy Bell from the Boston area put together this summer. You'll see it. It's in two colors. It's in black and white and in color. And the black and white stretches are training this summer in June, and the color parts are actual performance, so that you can tell the two apart. Oh, and one thing I should say, just to set things up, the stuff that you see in black and white, they'd been working on for maybe a week, 8 days. So I just find it incredible every time that they're able to get that far so quickly.
So stay in that position right there. Okay, we climb up, straight the split pose twirls. Okay, super fast, straight. Come down and transition. Go. 5, 4, 3. Ladder is taut. Tension roll out. Noah's right there.
Oh, sorry. That was so my fault. It's okay. I decided to take a step back. It's too long. Yeah. Let's do the front round again.
How many of you have seen Circus Smirkus? Enough. That's good. Those of you who haven't, it's based in Greensboro, up in the Northeast Kingdom. It's about 30 kids aged 10 to 18, but they also have a staff during the summer that ranges from about 90 during training, 90 people all told, so that would include the kids, during training, to about 60 who go on the road. Takes 25 or so trucks, buses, a huge trailer. It's a full traveling circus, and it covers New England, parts of upstate New York, goes as far south as Rhode Island these days, up to Maine. And over the course of a summer, it'll entertain between 45 and 50,000 people. So that's a lot of people. It's won all sorts of awards over the 25 years of its history. That's why the book came out, quarter century. Over those 25 years, it's brought in kids from pretty much all over the world: China, Mongolia, Kazakhstan, Ukraine, Russia. At the moment, it's the troupe that it had this summer had one boy from England and a girl from New Zealand, and it's always had that international flavor to it. And I'm also curious whether anybody has seen an article that just came out in Esquire. It's an article about Teller, of Penn and Teller, and a lawsuit that he's pursuing against somebody for stealing one of his tricks. There's a great line in there in which the writer, Chris Jones, writes that it's the collision between what you know and what you see that provides magic's greatest spark. The collision between what you know, that is, what you know to be possible, and what you see that provides magic's greatest spark. And I think circus does that too. It's the collision between what you know you yourself can do and what you see performers doing that provides a great spark. The difference, of course, between magic and circus is that you could see what we were showing you in black and white. You can see that it's just training. It's the ability to prepare over and over and over hard that allows the magic that you see in a ring to occur. And so we tried to do something very similar with this book. Many people who see the show just see the show. And what we tried to do was expand the reader's knowledge about what actually went into creating this circus. So to begin, why don't you come on up? And we'll talk a little bit about what happened even before Smirkus began, because there's a backstory to it that gets carried forward thematically all through its years.
The backstory is that I ran away to the circus when I was 19. This is way back in 1969. I was just a little baby. And I was looking for, not only for adventure, but an alternative lifestyle. And I figured that circus was something I wanted to find out about, the European-style circus, which based on basically family values. Families stay together, the kids work with their siblings and parents and grandparents and aunts and uncles, and they travel together. And I was very impressed with the children of professional circus performers. A 10-year-old circus kid could speak several languages by necessity, knew geography because they traveled all over the world, and they had close family values. I thought this is a different way of growing up, different way of education. And when I came back after a dozen years traveling with European shows as a clown, I wanted to give American kids a different experience in education. I would call it perhaps the apprentice model of education, where they're learning on the job, they're working with professionals and kids of all ages, so not just their own level. I tend to think that we really segregate kids in our school system. You know, the third graders are all third graders, fourth grades are all fourth graders, the same age. Whereas in the circus, you get to work with all levels, all generations, and I think that's a very important background for a broad education. So I started Circus Smirkus in Greensboro, Vermont, and it sort of took off, though the first years it was touch and go. I was teaching the local farm kids how to juggle and walk on a little low wire, and they were paying me in firewood and homemade jams and canned vegetables to get through the winter, and that's how it lasted the first few years, and it's grown since then. A little bit of background. You want to read something?
Yeah, I thought, just to put a punctuation mark on what Rob just said, in those early years, so you have to imagine, this is on an old farmstead up in the Northeast Kingdom, and especially even now, rustic doesn't have to do it justice. But back then it was truly rustic, and I thought I'd read a little bit about what it was like there at the beginning. Kids slept in the barn in barely converted horse stalls with sheets as doors, though some of the younger girls got bunks in the cramped rooms that lined the hall between the house and the barn. All the buildings, the barn, the farmhouse, the various sheds, had the worn, creaky look of centuries of hard use. Even after troopers moved out of the horse stalls and began sleeping in the three rustic trailers that are now euphemistically known as Trailerville, the whole place announced that creature comforts came second. This was circus, and rural Vermont, you made do. And it was as though once you popped out of the woods along Circus Road and got to the barn, you had entered another world. There was a single television with bad reception, no internet, and just one telephone for troopers to use. It's pretty much the same way today. Away from the cares of ordinary life, the in-crowds, the siren call of pop culture, the homework and teachers and parents and classmates, kids found room to be themselves. You know how you might get back to school in September and there's going to be cliques and bullies and all that stuff you have to deal with? Ozzy, who was one of Rob's right-hand guy in the early years. Ozzy would tell them right after they arrived, "We don't have that here. Forget about that stuff and breathe easy because it ain't happening here." So they were removed and paying close attention to circus itself. It was kind of by the seat of the pants to some extent.
To a big extent.
Yeah. Okay. I didn't want to be too dramatic about it. There's actually a great journal entry from their opening night, 1987. Actually, the few weeks before opening in 1987, that one of the counselors, Rob's cousin Annie, maintained. She wrote, and she kept this journal in the form of crises. So we'll just read a few of them. We'll start with crisis number 7. Kids and parents arrived today. The stove broke down from nervous tension, so another was brought in, but it didn't fit through the front door. Lots of discussion. It was dismantled, the door, that is. Meanwhile, the overloaded fridge shuddered and stopped in sympathetic protest. Crisis number 15. Skunko, the friendly critter living under the barn, came out to watch the septic proceedings. The septic tank had broken down. Septic proceedings, was appalled at the chaos, or the stink, sprayed his emotions, and left. Show opens in 3 days. Crisis number 19. The health inspector on a surprise visit, stone-faced, taking notes in the kitchen. Molly runs in barefoot, happily holding up a garden snake, and offers it to the cook, who is making stew. Crisis number 20, Rob can be seen holding his head in his hands, looking around, groaning. Rob should be at rehearsals, but the power went out. He's at the house in the basement, fooling with the fuse box, no lights in the house, tent, or barn. Crisis number 29, reporter and photographer arrive from the New York Times. A general note, Donnie is heard with his daily cry, year one, in reassurance to himself that we are learning. Stuart arrives at the tent with a phone message from Dottie, Rob's mom, that reads, "Tell him to stop all this nonsense and get a job in a bank."
Should I get into some Russian stuff?
Yeah.
Can you find the?
Absolutely.
Well, after 3 years of these wild adventures in the Northeast Kingdom, I decided that Circus Smirkus needed to go to another level and get some better coaching, higher level of staff and training for the kids. So I decided to go to where the best training school at the time was, and that was in Moscow. The Moscow State Circus School had the best training in the world. They were sending artists all over the place and had a high prestige. So long story short, I wrote a letter to the fellow that I thought was the director of the Moscow Circus, and it turned out to be a KGB gentleman posing as the director of the Moscow Circus. And long story cut short again, I ended up flying. The stories are all in the book here with lots of photos of the Russians. I had an appointment to go visit one of the Russian contacts. So I hopped on a plane without a visa because the visa never arrived. So I'm flying to Russia. It was still the Soviet Union back then, 1990. Flying to the Soviet Union without a visa, hoping I would get in, and being marched by the armed guards at the customs in the Moscow airport. But luckily I had posted circus stickers all over my luggage in various languages, English, and Russian, cirque. And the Russians love circus, so I managed to bribe my way through and juggle a little bit, and they stamped me a visa on the spot, after I paid them a $50 bribe also. But I managed to make the exchange with the Moscow Circus School and various circus coaches from Russia, and brought over, for a good decade, Russian kids and coaches. But as part of the deal was that the Russian bureaucracy would send over a KGB spy posing as an acrobatic coach. And I just had to accept that and deal with that. And here I write about that, how the KGB got busted in Hardwick, Vermont. So I'll read you a little bit about this. So along with the Russian circus kids and coaches, we got a boss from the Russian sponsor and two suspicious-looking officials who were supposedly from Soyuz-Cirque. They turned out to be KGB. As long as they stayed out of the way, I had no time for politicking. I had a show to mount. 1 o'clock in the morning, rehearsal period. The Russians have been here for 2 weeks. Exhausted from a long day, I awake to a knock on my door. It's the Hardwick Village Police. They want to know what to do with two drunken Russians who don't speak English and keep mumbling, Circus Smirkus. So I go down to the police station. There are the two KGB handcuffed to a radiator. I smile. Apparently they'd stolen my car, driven across some fields, and ended up in a haystack. Okay, I tell the officers. You've locked up the Soviet KGB. Play along with me. I'll act outraged and we'll keep them handcuffed for a while. Let's give them a show. So for 45 minutes, I yelled at the cops, sometimes pleading, then shouting, pointing back and forth to the worried prisoners. The officers threatened to take out their pistols. Finally, we shared some donuts with the prisoners and I took out my wallet. With my back to the prisoners, I pretended to bribe the officers, who then smiled and uncuffed the Russians. I nodded to them and said in Russian, let's go, pashli, everything okay. Suddenly, I was a big shot with the KGB. But there's an upshot to this story, which is history. The KGB guys returned to Russia, no doubt embellished this story about their terrifying ordeal inside the hostile American penal system, which of course struck fear into the hearts of the KGB bureaucracy, which then caused panic in the Kremlin, and 6 months later, the Soviet Union collapsed. So the Smirkus influence reaches far indeed, does it? I'm still friendly with those Russians, too.
They're still here?
They're still here, yeah.
Yeah, this was an amazing era, because you have to remember 1990, it's a year before the wall came down. And the organization that Rob referred to, Soyuz-Cirque, was immense. It was this global circus enterprise. It had training facilities all over the Soviet Union. There were 70 circus buildings, fixed buildings all over the Soviet Union. There were special hotels, special stores. The Soviets treated circus much like they treated ballet and opera and the other performing arts. And so circus performers could essentially grow up within a system, train live within the system, and know that their lives were basically taken care of. So all of a sudden in 1991, that comes crumbling down. This entire system collapses. And you have some of the best circus artists in the world suddenly opened up to the vicissitudes of the market. And for a decade, basically, during this transition, this little patch of ground in Greensboro, Vermont, was kind of the funnel for a number of them to come into this country and train.
Yeah, and they're still here. One of the coaches, who was a top aerialist in the Moscow Circus, came and was working with us and performing in our show and working with the kids. And I finally got out of the Russians their first impression of what Circus Smirkus was all about. Because we had a small tent, and these guys were used to traveling in the world in the biggest, brightest circuses. And they loved being with us here in Vermont, traveling around, putting up the tent. The kids were sitting on sawdust, on hay right up to the ring in the first years. And they said to me that this was what they imagined the Russian circuses were like 100 years ago. They don't have traveling circuses anymore. As Rob said, they have just the buildings. And they were so thrilled to work in a little tiny traveling show that went to small towns where the big shows never went. And so that's why one of the reasons I think we were very lucky to get these top artists from around the world coming here to Little Vermont. And some of them have moved here and now live here.
Yeah. And if you see a Smirkus show now, or if you've seen them over the years, the echoes of that time, of the creative ferment that happened between this meeting between the Russians and the Americans in the 90s in Greensboro, are still there. I mean, it's the circus now, in some ways, is an amalgam of those two influences. I still have this very strong memory. So I followed the story that I first wrote about them, which, small coincidence, was assigned to me by Bill McKibben's wife. So Bill was in here just before us. That story, I followed the circus in 1999. And I have this very strong memory of watching training, and one of the performers, a girl, she was about 15, was doing a hand balance, working on a hand balance act. So hand balance is exactly what it sounds like. They're upside down on their hands doing remarkable things. And she was on two posts. So the ground's there, and then these posts rise about like this, and she was up on those, perfectly vertical, and then coming down into a kind of a bent body shape, but with flawless lines. I mean, it was a beautiful thing to watch. And then she finishes holding that for probably 15 or 20 seconds, swings her legs down, and is just the picture of grace, of adult grace, in this 15-year-old. And she finishes, and the coach said to her, "That was good," which was very rare for a Russian coach to do. "That was good." And she kind of bounces up and gets this huge smile. Her teeth were covered with braces, and goes, "Awesome!" and goes bouncing out of the tent. And that conjunction of grace and technique with American teenage exuberance was, I think, what Smirkus captured in that era, and what it still carries forward today. That's why it's unique. You will not see that really in any other circus in the country. And I'm interested in what how that went. Why don't you talk a little bit about that sort of joining of those two influences?
Two cultures?
Yeah.
Yeah, it was a wonderful decade in the 1990s, and I took Circus Smirkus over to Russia actually in 1990. It was still the Soviet Union, and we performed there a joint program with Russian circus kids and American circus kids, and it was the first time that had happened in the Soviet Union. And the Soviet papers wrote about the blending of the cultures. The Americans, we were clearly not as skilled at that point as the Russian kids. Our kids' skill level was, down below them for sure, because the Russian kids were taking this seriously. This was going to be their profession, and they were being trained by their families. But the Russian papers wrote, sometimes it was hard to discover who were the American kids and who were the Russian kids as they were working together in some of the acts. And what the paper felt that was happening was that the Americans brought a certain vitality and energy and enthusiasm to the performance, whereas the Russians brought the highly polished skill. And the blending of those was what was remarkable, that they blended well together, and that's what has been happening at Circus Smirkus since, is that we've been opening up the Russians so they're not so formal with their just skill technique, that they become more spontaneous, and we're giving the enthusiastic American kids a lot more disciplined training. So there's a blending of the two cultures that is being mixed and matched today. Do you want to read Rick's story? And then we can do some questions.
Yeah, exactly. So we'll close with one small story. Circus Smirkus is today actually not just a traveling tent circus. It's also an organization that runs an extremely successful summer camp. Usually 400, 450 kids over the course of a summer. And then throughout the year does a set of school residencies where they'll take over a school for a day or a week or even 2 weeks and teach everybody in the school circus skills on the theory that there are great lessons to be learned in discipline and hard work and aiming for something transcendent. The man who runs the residencies these days is named Rick Davis. And Rick contributed a small piece of writing to this book that we thought we'd close on. I won't say anything more about it. This comes from one of his residencies in a particular school. He wrote, "Her arms never pointed in the same direction. Her eyes were fixed downward. Her body was bent. Cerebral palsy is cruel, and Annie did not deserve it, but it was hers for life. It was show day on the final day of a school residency, and the students had chosen the acts they wished to perform. Easy for most students, not so easy for Annie. Most assumed she could not participate. The time came for the globe balancing act, and students lined up to take their turns standing tall on the big, intimidating ball. A rolling globe is about this high, and you stand on it, keep your feet moving. It's the only way to keep your balance on it. I had expected 6 students, but there, to my surprise, was a 7th at the end of the line, Annie. As each student before her performed, you could feel the unspoken thoughts of the audience. Annie, standing on the globe, can she do it? I, too, was worried. In my school residencies, I don't teach circus tricks, I teach circus goals. I point students toward the tools that they can use to reach their goals. Try again, try a new way. Watch, listen, step by step, go slow. I call these circus secrets, and I ask students to use these tools whenever they have a voice inside saying, I can't do it. Annie must have taken these secrets to heart because with her eyes fixed on the globe, she was determined to try. I held her arms as she ascended, and her body shook as she sought balance. My knees braced the ball firmly so that Annie could find it. She was determined, and her determination inspired me to forget about keeping up the pace of the show and to stay with her as long as it took. In globe balancing, there is a precise moment when you know that you have found your center, and everyone has a center, even if you have a body that is bent. The magic moment came to Annie. She at last found her center, realized her balance, and started to rise a little taller, breathe a little easier and calmer, and smile with a brightness that pierced the audience's heart. I let go of her arms, and Annie stood by herself, and the crowd erupted. Each of us can be more than we think we are. This is the message of circus. Humans are capable of incredible feats, and that goes for all of us, no matter who we are. For each of us, these are feats that seem out of our reach. Some never even try. But during that school residency show, Annie showed us all that anyone can go further. So, thank you for listening. We're happy to take questions for a couple of minutes, and then Rob will perform a small bubble circus.
Is there time for that?
Yeah, we got time. Yeah.
Have you had any film offers for your book? I think it would make a marvelous.
For the book, yeah, it would, wouldn't it? Yes, no, we haven't.
We will accept any offer.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
With the Russian students, did you find their transition from more rigid training to more flexible training? Did they find it difficult to transition into that?
The Russian kids at first did find it very difficult because they were so rigid and so structured, the kind of training that they had in Moscow, and they were taught never to question a coach or even hardly ever talk to a coach. It was just training from top down. And they were able to see these kids, the American kids, talking back, not talking back to us, but asking questions and having dialogue back and forth. And the Russian kids were just not used to that. So they were very quiet at first. But when they loosened up, they really loosened up. And we got letters from some of them that it was hard for them to get back to the Soviet Union and perform for audiences that were not quite as open. But they learned to, instead of just to bow this way, they turned and bowed to all directions of the audience. You know, they were loosening up as the summer went along.
Any other questions? Yeah.
I wondered how the kids are chosen to be in the traveling circus. Is there an audition process?
There's an audition process. I wish there are some kids who were out front performing. I wish they were in here. In the early days, it was pretty much just enough if you could do a forward roll or juggle a little bit. Because the truth is, in the country at large, at that age level, there just weren't many circus skills. These days, there are circus schools and camps and other things all around the country, and so the skill level that you need to get into the troupe is much higher than it was. It's really pretty daunting. I can speak from personal experience. I have 2 kids who are in it now, and it's really hard work. So the audition process now is a 2-day process. It's tended in the past to be in Essex at Champlain Valley Expo, but it can be other places as well. If you're trying just to get into the troupe the first time, you have to send in a video. They'll get 100 to 200 over the course of a year, and then they narrow that down to 40 kids, but of those 40, probably 25 are returning troopers. So really, the new kids are trying for 5 slots. And then the live auditions themselves are, you prepare a 3-minute act, and then there are strength assessments and acrobatic assessments and improvs and sort of all sorts of other things. So, and they're both looking, something that Rob started from the very beginning. It's true that they're looking for skills, but in some ways that's not the most important thing that they're looking for. You can.
Personality. Skills on one hand, but personality on the other have to be balanced, you know. And that's a long discussion we have with kids when they're going to audition. Well, I did promise the book fair that I would blow a few bubbles. They brought us here so I could do this, so I better do it before we. Yeah. And this is because bubbles started off as something that I was doing in Circus Smirkus from the very beginning. Large bubbles and bubbles inside bubbles that were floating around the audience. And I'll just do a few small little tricks in this area here. So if you watch carefully, you'll be able to do these at home. All you need is a straw and a wand. And that's basically, I'll put on a little music here if you don't mind too, just to set a little atmosphere. Well, there we go.
Clearly the space is haunted.
Haunted with technical difficulties. Here's a little caterpillar, breakdancing caterpillar bubble. Here's a shrinking bubble. You need a dry finger for this one. Here's a bubble inside of a jar. The longest lasting bubble I had in a jar lasted for about 3.5 months and slowly changed colors every morning. You could go and say, "How you doing this morning, bub?" And you could see very faint changing of the colors. So there's you can have a pet bubble sitting in a jar. Here comes, let's do a volcano bubble. Whoop. Whoop. Here comes, let's do this one. I have to have a little bit of bubble perfume here. Make sure the surface is wet. This is just water. Here's the romance and marriage of the bubbles. They get together, they meet, they rub a little bit. And then magically they do a little kissing. And they become like one. Oop. And one last one here. Let's do the, I'll do a carousel for you. Whoop. And it turned into a spaceship and floated down. Well, those are just a few little tricks that you can do with bubbles. Again, you just need a straw, you just need a bubble wand, and various things to blow bubbles on top of, and there you go. Thank you, everybody.
Thanks for coming. We'll be more than happy to sign books out in the lobby right afterward. We just need to clean up a little bit, and then we'll be there.